Yes, the Uncanny Valley effect, a creepy, interesting phenomenon that seems to have all of social media in its grip these days. I'm telling you, I can't even scroll on TikTok without finding something on the Uncanny Valley effect. But what's really going on underneath? Do we understand the neuroscience behind this effect? What does the research say? Well, that's why I'm here today. Let's dive in. The Uncanny Valley effect. It's a phenomenon that seems to captivate lots of people from around the globe. Unfortunately, I've yet to see someone make a theoretically sound, research-based video for the masses, and while there are loads of publications out there, many folks just aren't interested in reading abstracts. What? That's where I come into play. I'm a PhD researcher in human development and neuroscience, and for whatever reason, I decide to research even in my free time. Please send help. I don't think it's healthy either. In today's video, I plan to go over the Uncanny Valley effect in all its glory. I scanned the internet to compile one large literature review on the subject, as well as a few theories of my own to keep you engaged and interested, all while digging deeper into the mystery. So, let's begin. I can remember first feeling the Uncanny Valley effect as a child at the Gettysburg Wax Figure Museum in the early 2000s. For those of you that live in Pennsylvania like me, you already know where this is going. This museum was hands down the most horrifying museum I'd ever been in. The figurines were tall, lanky, lifeless. It was cold to keep the wax safe. I had a full-blown panic attack. Can you blame me?
Oh, hell no!
Since then, I always wondered why and how that feeling was evoked within me. Was it because they were lifeless, emotionless? Was it their features that were unexpected to me? Was it a lack of human essence? I don't know. So today's video will hopefully help us answer some of these questions, as well as give a more neuroscientific approach to the discussion. A lot of the comments I see on the UV effect are distilled to simple explanations like, it's because we were wired to avoid death, or it's because there were monsters while we evolved, and these comments I think are tiny fragments of the whole truth, meaning that we have a lot of work to do before we can say that this is really the reasoning behind the effects. And that is precisely what part 1 of this video plans to do. I've collected some of the most interesting publications out there on the UV effect, as well as current theories to help set the framework for this phenomenon. The Uncanny Valley effect was conceptualized in 1970 by roboticist Masahiro Mori, who published a short essay and coined the Uncanny Valley, Bukumi no Tani in Japanese, which translates to Valley of the Eerie Feeling. And it suggests that more human-like representations are perceived more favorably, but only up to a certain point, at which there's this huge dip in affinity for realistic representations. So we get the sense that they're almost like humans, but not quite. There are a ton of current theories out there. For example, the evolutionary aesthetics theory, which say that some entities appear uncanny not because they lack any sort of realism, but because they're not attractive to us. For example, maybe their characteristics don't signal things like fertility and fitness. There's the pathogen avoidance theory, which I think is probably the most common that I see on TikTok or online forums, which is exactly what you think it is. We have these imperfections in these human replicas which cause disgust, and because of that, we interpret it as signals of disease, so we stay away from it. There's the fear of mortality theory, which is that these human replicas remind us of our own death. There's categorical perception theory, which is that there's uncertainty that arises due to the difficulty of binning whether or not these are humans. There's more cognitive approaches like the violation of expectation theory, which is saying that there's a mismatch between different modalities. So for example, appearance versus motion, or face versus voice, which can elicit the Uncanny Valley effect. So this is where you have an expectation that something is going to look or sound or be like a human, but that expectation is not met. And then there's the mind perception theory, which is saying that there are these human-like replicas that can be so realistic that humans start to attribute mind to them. For example, we think that these are artificial beings that can think and can feel, which is particularly unsettling. But what about the neuroanatomy of the Uncanny Valley effect? Have there been any fMRI studies to let us know what provokes this effect? Well, we know when processing humans, we see the medial temporal lobe, for example, the hippocampus, entorhinal, perirhinal areas, mid-insula, and even the amygdala were responsive and active when looking at humans. But this other study, we see that when we go in the opposite direction, when you're processing things that are not quite human or things that are related to avatars or characters in a game, for example, we see the dorsal and ventral striatum. Things like the putamen, caudate, thalamus, and red nucleus were responsive. This is interesting because if you know anything about the neuroanatomy of the brain, you know that areas such as the putamen, caudate, thalamus, red nucleus, these are a little bit more earlier in evolution. These are older structures in the brain. And it's interesting that in humans, we see the amygdala being responsive. And the amygdala, a lot of people know this already. It's mediated by fear. So I'm interested in why that's the case. So we're kind of getting some initial evidence that this uncanny valley effect is very, very old, at least in our history of processing it. There's also the possibility that there are multiple valleys. Yes, there's not just one, but maybe there are even two. Straight and Schutz in 2014 found 2 peaks in the prefrontal hemodynamic activity. One for robots considered most human-like, and the other for robots judged as the least human-like. So these are robots with only maybe 1 or 2 human features. So this suggests that there may be distinctions between the types of peaks that we see. Maybe this is why movies like Christine, which is a film about a killer car, might spark some uncanny fear, or when food items make unexpected faces. For those interested, there are a lot of publications on the fusiform gyrus, which is one part of the brain that is especially sensitive to these types of effects, and Gautier's Greeble study, which is where they found that after training participants on aspects of greebles, which are these fake, non-human creatures, that the fusiform face area in the participants' brains responded just as well as greebles as it did to human faces, which is interesting. So we can actually train ourselves to find faces and things that aren't human. Going back to that violation of expectations theory and prediction, we see that movement also becomes a very salient part of the uncanny valley effect. So Ergen and colleagues back in 2018, they pinned 2 different types of human agents together. One didn't move at all, it was in a static form, and the other moved. And they asked participants, which one was creepier, and they also hooked them up to an EEG. And they found that the violation of expectations was significantly greater for the dynamic movement versus their static form of an android. So that's an interesting finding as well. So, making predictions about the movements of these robots or these fake non-human creatures, it seems to be a really important aspect to this uncanniness. And I guess from my own anecdotal experience, that makes sense. Going back to my experiences as a child and in the wax figure museum, there was always a lot more creepy when the wax figure moved, because it was just so unexpected, so just jittery and not fluid like one would expect. So I'm starting to lean towards this theory as a very important part, a very important piece to this uncanniness that we sense. But interestingly, you can have a valley even without stimuli. So Gray and Wegner in 2012 set up an experiment where a robot was never shown to the participants, but it was described as having emotions. And that is what participants found as especially unnerving. So needless to say, there's a lot to take in when discussing this effect, and clearly there's a lot of stones left unturned, and I don't know if we really understand all of the components of this uncanny valley effect. So that's why I wanted to dig into part 2 to figure out, are there other forms of uncanny valley effects? What does it look like? And what can pop culture tell us? So there's much to be said about the visual phenomenon of the uncanny valley effect. But what about things that aren't figures or avatars? What about sounds and environments? One study by Deal and colleagues suggests that when participants are shown liminal spaces, quote, participants majorly reported structural anomalies like displaced, distorted, missing, or repeated features as the sources of uncanniness. That is from Deal and Lewis in 2022. So, again, we see this same pattern, even in things like liminal spaces, right? Like, I don't know how many of you watch Queso, but I'm always watching Queso with my husband, and I think it's just hilarious. Like, every single time that he has a Backrooms stream, I'm always watching it because I just find it fascinating. And all of these characteristics, like displaced, distorted, missing, or repeating features, these are things that we also see in the Uncanny Valley effect. So it seems like it can be transferable to the ambiance, to the environment, and not just a particular figure. Going back to that categorical uncertainty hypothesis by Wang in 2015, they suggest that the Uncanny Valley effect emerges because of the difficulty a person has to categorize an entity. So there was this person, Dennis Jansen, who published his master's. And so, yes, your thesis does matter. People can and will read it. And I read Dennis Jansen's master's from 2019. And this person set up an experiment where they wanted to test audio effects of the Uncanny Valley. And he had different levels, right? So, like, 100% human and 0% robot is like the 0 level, okay? And then maybe second level is like, 90% human and 10% robot, okay? And so he's morphing human and robotic sounds together to make this very uncanny sound. And he found that the most reported uncanniness was when the stimuli is 67.5% human and 32.5% robotic, aka his 6th level. Higher than that was the 7th level, which was 75% human and 25% robotic. Those were the most uncanny audios. And I know that there's these popular TikTok sounds like, well, you don't know me. That song has been going around lately, and it was written by Laurie Anderson in the 1980s. And I think that is a fabulous example of an uncanny audio. And I think, in my opinion, that this is some preliminary evidence that the Uncanny Valley effect is not just a deterrent of death, of things like corpses or disease, because we're finding that both audio and the environment have similar Uncanny Valley effects. There are also aspects of folklore and culture that I think are really important to bring up because it gives us contextual information about this Uncanny Valley effect. The Native Americans often cite skinwalkers as a prime source of uncanniness, and skinwalkers are thought to be able to shift into humans, but because they lack a soul, their presence is said to be uncanny at times. They mimic voices of loved ones that sound just a bit off, or maybe their appendages are just a little bit too long or abnormal. And we really saw this skyrocket in the creepypasta era. If you grew up in that era like I did, these very interesting characters like Slender Man or Jeff the Killer, they seemed to roll the internet some ages ago. And it's for good reason. I think both of those figures hit the nerve on uncanniness as well. Mirrors are also a big part of folklore. There are a ton of cultures that have similar sentiments that mirrors can steal our souls or that demons can live with them and mimic our faces or our movements. And I know that there are a lot of people that report feeling uneasy around mirrors, or they say that they've experienced uncanny effects. In fact, your visual perception can be changed when you stare at a mirror for too long, and a lot of people report distortions in their own faces, and they can see different hallucinations, different monsters, relatives that have been deceased for a while. It's an interesting phenomenon, and there's actually a test. So there's an experiment called the 7-minute mirror gazing test under low illumination. You can check out the publication. It's by Caputo and colleagues from 2014, and they did an experiment with mirror gazing. And they found, a similar, again, it's a very similar flavor to the Uncanny Valley effect. It's highly cognitive in its roots, it seems. There are also similar disorders that exist that seem to overlap with the Uncanny Valley effect. So I mostly work in psychopathology. Currently, I'm working on externalizing disorders. But I'm aware that there are a lot of other disorders out there that are affected by visual perceptive distortions. Capgras delusion, for example. This is a belief that the sufferer's friends or family members are imposters. And a lot of patients with Capgras delusion, they explain that their former loved ones seem like robots. That sounds familiar. There's a case study, Mary, aged 40 years. She was referred to a psych eval out of concern that she was unable to care for her child. And this patient stated on numerous occasions that her 9-year-old daughter, Sarah, had been placed in the custody of CPS and replaced by an imposter. And she reported that she had given birth to twins, but the hospital record only documented the birth of Sarah. And on occasion, she would show up to Sarah's school, refusing to pick her up, screaming, "Give me my real daughter, I know what you've done." There's Cotard syndrome. It comprises of a lot of different delusions. It ranges from this belief that the sufferer has lost their organs, their blood, or body parts, or things are decaying, or that their soul is dead. In the case of Elle's mental health and insomnia worsened despite 3 weeks of treatment, and she complained that she felt like a zombie. She was convinced that her organs were decaying, and she refused to eat and purged to prove that the food that she ate was actually not being digested. And further, she refused to urinate and defecate because she believed that her bowels and bladder were dysfunctional. There's derealization and depersonalization. This is when somebody feels disconnected from reality or their own body. A lot of times, folks, they explain it as though they feel unreal or like they've been in a dreamlike state for weeks, months, sometimes years. Sometimes they feel like they don't have a mind or that they can't actually feel food or drinks or perceive sounds differently from before. So this led me to believe that maybe there's an underlying valence system within the neural network that tie all of these phenomena together. So in my work, I personally subscribe to the research domain criteria, aka RDoC matrix, which is meant to give a more in-depth understanding of some of the systems that are interplay in psychopathology. It's not necessarily removing the DSM-5, but it's a structured system. So the hope of RDoC is to use these matrix domains as sort of in conjunction with the DSM to give us better insight into the etiology of the disorders. So the RDoC matrix has a negative valence construct, things like acute threat, potential threat, sustained threat, frustrated non-reward. These help characterize things like anxiety or fear. There are positive valence systems, reward seeking, consummatory behavior, reward, and habit learning. Delusions, on the other hand, stem from the matrix social processing constructs, which includes mental states, reception of non-facial communication, action perception, again, very cognitively focused. So in this end, work has been done in the RDoC construct of expectancy reward prediction error. According to Angus in 2017, it's been long argued that prediction errors convey an uncanny feeling. Again, going back to that violation of expectation theory, I think holds true for a lot of disorders and a lot of pathological valence systems. And he found that repeated prediction errors may move a person from a common feeling of strangeness towards delusions in psychosis or disorders such as Capgras syndrome. And that several of these systems, not just one, fail together to create the delusions. So my conclusion here is that in the most extreme cases, Uncanny Valley effect seems to share similar valence structures to some psychopathologies, namely in prediction error and that expectation violations theory. So I really think that future research should look into this process in greater detail. For example, I think it would be beneficial to focus on other EEG components in the Uncanny Valley, things like frontal alpha asymmetry to detect relative activation between the hemispheres. Or, looking at RUPs in the ERP components used in EEG. So, focusing on reward processing or frustrated non-reward, for example, might give us a little bit more insight into how this uncanny valley effect is structured. So, taken together, I think it's safe to say that the uncanny valley effect is definitely beyond just a fear of death or disease. I think there is sufficient evidence that I've gone over and perused through in this literature review to suggest that it has a direct cognitive association, especially in terms of violation of expectations and its shared characteristics in psychopathology. But there are a lot of unanswered questions. For example, why do these cognitive systems fail? Is there an evolutionary component? And that I just don't think we know yet. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you've learned something. Perhaps something new about this uncanny valley effect. We dived pretty deeply into the literature, which I think is something that was missing in a lot of videos and video essays that I've been watching. So I wanted to fill the gap, if you will. And please tune in next time. I'm sure that I will have something interesting popping out here pretty soon. So thanks for tuning in and have a great day.